In the distance, two men came into view, one on his knees, barely alive. A silver-haired man with a bloodied sword stepped forward and called out to the other, Haydenreich, remarking that even a hero could end up like this. He added with a wicked grin that if Hayden had just worried about his own safety in that flashy mansion, none of this would have happened. Hayden, bloodied and gasping, demanded how Julian could do this. Julian, still menacing, replied that Hayden should have been nicer when Julian was supporting him as a hero. Hayden, incredulous, asked if Julian could really kill his own master. Julian laughed, raised his sword, and said it'd be no trouble at all. Then off went Hayden's head. The moment Hayden died, a nerdy-looking man could be seen screaming at his monitor, clutching it like it had betrayed him. He couldn't believe the hero had gone down so meaninglessly. Haydenreich, the genius demon hunter, leader of the Northern Frontline, and protagonist of Kill the Demon King, was gone, just like that, at the hands of his own traitorous student, Julian. Fuming, the nerd grumbled about how much time and money had poured into this game, how the sequel had totally betrayed him, and how speechless he was. In a fit of rage, he slammed the keyboard, typed a scathing review, and canceled his pre-order right then and there. As he checked, a note appeared, greeting him and claiming to be from Formwell Software, the developers of Kill the Demon King. It asked if he was Mr. Lee Suhu, a loyal player for 5 years. Lee wondered if this was an automated message. Another message popped up, agreeing with him and noting that they had seen his canceled DLC pre-order, assuming he was unhappy with the story. Lee grumbled that they clearly didn't want to give him a refund. Then a new message appeared with a website link. Curious, Lee clicked it, and in an instant, a bright light shot from the PC, surprising him, and he was sucked inside. Lee struggled, telling himself to switch off the PC, but nothing worked. The pull was too strong, and he was sucked in. Falling through nothingness, he panicked, wondering where he was going. Then looked down and saw a desolate wasteland. Closer inspection revealed it was the site where Reich and Julian had last fought. Suddenly, a massive scorpion demon appeared, the same one from Kill the Demon King. Starting now. A system window popped up, showing his stats, exceptional swordsman, incredible instincts, and a skill to detect demon weaknesses. Surprised, but not thinking long, Lee bolted as the scorpion lunged. Dodging its attacks, he thought grimly that one hit would leave him nothing but pixels. As Lee braced for the scorpion's next attack, he couldn't dodge in time and thought he was done for. Yet when it struck, nothing happened. Confused, he wondered why it didn't hurt. The scorpion pressed on, and Lee, annoyed, decided he wasn't taking any more hits. With a powerful blow, he instantly killed it. Stunned, Lee wondered if his body had always been this light. Then he remembered the stats he'd seen and realized he might have undergone character possession. Before he could think more, the scorpion, somehow still alive, got up and chased him again. Lee ran, still baffled, but relieved that had possessed Haydenreich. The hero had spent thousands of hours playing. With that thought, he slashed the scorpion in half with a single powerful strike. Lee, impressed with himself, wondered if Head finally killed the scorpion and noted the strength matched Reich's. Satisfied, he thought he might even change the story and save Reich from Julian. Just then, a system notification popped up. Head obtained a common attack called Crescent Slash. Confused, Lee didn't remember Reich having this skill and started doubting if he was really him. To check, he pulled back his hood, and glancing at the sword, he immediately knew. Another system message confirmed it. Silver hair, slit eyes, poker face, exceptional swordsman, Demon King's vessel, immaculate mana control, incredible instincts. And the name, Julian Cryfart Plassen. Lee, furious, could only scream internally, what the hell is going on? 1 week later, Lee, now in Julian's body, stared in the mirror. A walking hypocrisy, the hotbed of betrayal. He muttered, seeing Julian Cryfart Plassen's fox-like eyes and truly evil expression. Widening his eyes, he thought he still couldn't believe he had to live as Julian. It had been a week since he started this new life. Attempts to return to reality failed, and even talking to himself formally felt absurd. Still, Lee admitted he was handsome. His head would fit his body 8 or 9 times Korean handsome level, and he finally understood Julian's popularity. Outside, a boy panicked as he approached Julian's house, feeling like he was walking into his own grave. When he opened the door, he greeted Julian nervously and announced that Haran had arrived. Julian, hearing the greeting, fixed Haran with a menacing smile, wondering why a direct Cryfart relative was here. Haran, seeing Julian's expression, froze in fear. He nervously asked if Julian's body was okay. Julian replied he was fine and, thanks to Haran, had been well. Haran laughed awkwardly, relieved, admitting he didn't expect the peerless Julian to faint and had worried. They shared an awkward chuckle, while Julian wondered what Haran was really up to. Julian didn't expect Haran to visit personally, while Haran thought about Julian's calm, relaxed demeanor and realized he wasn't easy to shake. He briefly wondered if he should try anyway. Haran hesitated, then told Julian had heard a rumor. Julian, curious, asked what it was. Haran explained that people were saying Julian had lost his memory. Surprised, Julian wondered if that was why everyone had been whispering. He did admit his behavior had been a little suspicious. Haran quickly added it was just a rumor, so Julian shouldn't worry. But Julian, with a menacing smile, asked if Haran actually believed it. Terrified, Haran blurted that he didn't, but inwardly noted Julian hadn't even flinched at his answer. Haran looked into Julian's eyes and smiled nervously, realizing he had no clue what Julian might do. He thought Julian probably already knew he was here under the Noble Elder Association's orders. There was no helping the situation. Clearing his throat, Haran told Julian not to take the maid's gossip too seriously and quickly changed the topic. He was here to deliver a message from the Elder Association. The nobles group valued bloodlines above all and wouldn't ignore a collateral family member trying to seize power. Julian, though technically collateral, considered himself the royal family's dog thanks to his swordsmanship and magic. A thorn in their side, the elders wanted him gone, so Julian thought carefully. If this was from them, he'd have to watch his step. Julian asked Haran about the message. Haran explained that Julian was to participate in the Shut Eyes Entrance test as an instructor. The Shut Eyes secretly carried out palace missions and acted as the royal guard, gathering only those with exceptional martial skill. Lee noted that Julian was already a member, making it suspicious that those who disliked him had chosen him for this task. He wondered whether he should even follow their request. Haran, meanwhile, expected Julian to see through the elder's tricks and avoid it, wondering how he could convince him. Before he could plan further, Julian declared he would go as the supervisor. Haran, shocked and unprepared for that answer, asked about his injury. Julian casually said it had just healed, leaving Haran even more stunned, silently thinking Julian was truly taking the bull by the horns. Julian thought to himself that he didn't know the situation well, so it was safer to just curry favor. Haran, unsure how to handle him, decided to create some distance. He agreed with Julian and told him to prepare to leave. As Haran tried to exit, Julian called out, making him wonder if he wouldn't be allowed to go. Turning back, Haran listened as Julian, holding a pot of flowers, handed it to him with a menacing smile, saying he just wanted to give him an orchid for peace of mind. Haran took the pot, but as he walked out and shut the door, his legs gave out, too shaken by Julian. Remembering the encounter, he muttered to himself that had forgotten Julian's nickname, the Smiling Executioner. Julian sighed, noting Head dealt with one of them, and muttered that because of something Head said thoughtlessly, the room had become a field of orchids. He needed to get rid of them. Changing the topic, he added that Haran must be waiting, so he needed to prepare to leave. Lee thought that if it were Julian, he wouldn't go out without his sword, and should dress properly. Opening the wardrobe, Lee was surprised by Julian's style and admitted he hated the clothes but had to pull them off perfectly. Dressed, Julian called out to Haran, startling him, and said he was ready. They should go, as he couldn't wait for the interview. Then he asked where it would take place. Moments later, the two rode in the carriage. Haran reminded Julian that the Shut Eyes enrollment test would be held at the training grounds of Veil Academy. Julian thought the academy wasn't important in the game, but he vaguely remembered it. Curious, Julian asked what kind of place it was. Haran, puzzled, asked if he wasn't already familiar, since Julian had attended Veil Academy. Thinking quickly, Julian said it had been so long had forgotten and guessed the academy had probably changed a lot. Haran agreed. Lee silently hoped no one there would remember Julian from back then. Soon, they arrived, and one of the attendants announced that they had reached the academy. As they stepped outside, Julian remarked that the academy was much larger in real life, having only seen in the game. Haran looked confused. Lee, in awe of the scenery, thought even the game's best graphics couldn't compare. Watching Julian, Haran wondered what he was scheming. Lee noticed Haran's fear and felt a little sorry for him. Julian then told Haran he could leave, grateful for the escort. Haran, However, said he wanted to stay and see how the test ran. Julian was surprised. Had expected Haran to be desperate to leave and wondered about the ominous aura Had sensed from him. Was it mana, power, or just fear taking form? Julian opened his system and saw he had a skill called Color of Negation, which made him sensitive to negative emotions and let him judge them by the aura's color. Suddenly, he understood why he could read people so well. He had always been good at sensing emotions, especially fear, and knew how to exploit them. He could win fights using fear alone or manipulate anger to make opponents lose reason and make mistakes, all thanks to his natural traits. Thinking about Haran, Julian realized the reason he hadn't left despite being scared was likely the Elder Association's orders to watch him. The association saw Julian as a thorn in their side. With rumors of his memory loss spreading, now would be the perfect time for them to act, and Julian understood why. Julian thought to himself that he couldn't let this happen. He needed to survive and return to real life. Just then, a man bumped into him. Seeing it was Julian, the man fell backward in terror. Others nearby panicked, shaking at the sight of the royal family's crazed dog. One muttered that the guy who bumped into Julian was done for. Haran urged Julian to calm down, saying the boy was just a kid. Lee, observing, noted the students hadn't even done anything wrong, but understood their fear. He hated Julian too, the character he now possessed. Beneath the fear, there was likely anger. Lee wished Julian were a nicer character and realized he had to calm the students down. Before he could act, a woman called out, greeting Julian. He immediately recognized her and replied with her name, Eileen. Eileen Donatian, a main character from Kill the Demon King. Starting now, was an instructor at Veil Academy affiliated with the Adrathan Empire's Mage Tower. A genius with metal magic, she had reached Tier 5 by age 24. Lee remembered how she had given Reich plenty of advice during the Academy arc, but now he wondered why she was greeting Julian and whether they knew each other. Hoping it might lighten the tense atmosphere, he tried to stay optimistic. Then Lee noticed something troubling through the Color of Negation. Not fear or anger, but resentment. He wondered what Julian had done to earn it. Eileen was an advanced mage, and Lee knew he couldn't make her suspicious. He needed a quick plan to calm things down. Speaking as Julian, he addressed her formally. Halfling of the Donatian family, who permitted you to speak to me. But it was useless. Eileen remained expressionless, unmoved. Lee realized Eileen was unfazed and muttered that the problem was being Julian. His previous attempt hadn't eased the tension, so he decided to go all in and fully play the villain. Drawing Julian's sword, he shouted, "Being a halfling, does that mean you only have half your hearing? Do you know what noise someone makes when they die?" Flashing a menacing smile. He thought to himself that this should finally scare her and calm the situation. But Eileen, unmoved, released her magic and asked sharply if he had just drawn his sword. She scolded Julian, saying that even the shut eyes own shouldn't act this way towards students or professors. This was an act of violence against all of Veil Academy, and she would not forgive him. Julian, seeing Eileen resist, wondered how to handle the situation. This wasn't what he expected. Eileen declared she wouldn't be an easy opponent. Julian realized he couldn't just scare her. He had to fight. Without hesitation, Eileen struck, but Julian blocked easily. He still wondered if they were really going to fight, while Eileen grew annoyed that he wasn't paying full attention. She shouted for the students to get away, and panicked they ran. Haran, terrified, wished had left when Julian told him to. Julian then charged, warning Eileen not to look away. Closing in, their faces nearly touched, causing Eileen to blush and scream in embarrassment, while unleashing a powerful attack at the same time. Julian dodged Eileen's attack and muttered that her strikes were frightening, as if she put real emotion into them. Eileen, still embarrassed, thought she hadn't intended them to be fatal, but Julian had dodged every one as expected. She remembered when she had once admired Julian as the ideal noble. Back then, girls swooned over him, and Eileen, a freshman, watched from afar, impressed by his charm, connections, and rising star reputation. Seeing him gave her hope that being from a collateral line wouldn't hold her back. Julian, the bastard, had once been someone she truly looked up to and believed could challenge society's prejudice. Eileen recalled that back then, she had confused respect with love, confessed to Julian, and been promptly rejected. Back in the present, her anger surged. She gathered a massive amount of magic and unleashed it, but Julian dodged effortlessly. Fuming, Eileen told him to just take a hit to relieve her anger. Julian, realizing it was time to wrap things up, swiftly appeared behind her and tapped her head with the back of his sword, signaling her defeat. He told her they should stop playing around, while Eileen, still flustered, couldn't hide her shyness. Eileen focused, asking Julian what he was doing and if he was looking down on her. She questioned why he hadn't used his moonlight sword when he had an opening, noting he could have killed her. Feeling his mana, she pressed why he hadn't finished her. Julian, smiling menacingly, asked if she really wanted to know. Eileen, wondering if he had finally acknowledged her feelings, said she did. Julian explained that it was Haran's first time, so he couldn't show him the testing center, and everyone else was too scared. Eileen was shocked by the reason. Julian then asked if she understood and, addressing her as halfling, told her to lead the way. Haran, panicking, muttered that Julian could have said it more respectfully. Eileen was still in disbelief that this was why Julian had spared her. Walking, Julian thought the moonlight sword she mentioned was of course his own. Normally, covering a sword with aura made it glow, but his sword was special. Its bluish hue seemed to hold moonlight itself. He had used it to slay countless demons, earning its fearsome name. Lee worried how he could possibly wield such a sword and noted that Eileen was starting to catch on, a very bad sign. Making an evil face, he schemed to keep her from finding out. Eileen and Haran, noticing Julian's expression, wondered what he was planning. Julian asked if there was a problem, and the two quickly replied it was nothing, urging him to follow as they led the way. Moments later, they arrived at the training ground. Julian opened the door and greeted everyone, apologizing for being slightly late and joking that Professor Eileen had gotten sidetracked. Eileen, hearing this, looked visibly irritated. Julian introduced himself and explained he would conduct the Shut Eyes entrance exam. Confidently, he added that everyone had surely heard of him before. Meanwhile, Haran scanned the crowd and spotted the second son of the Torso family, noting he had expected him to appear. The Torso family, longtime allies of the Cryfarts, considered it a great honor to be linked with the Shut Eyes, but entry was extremely competitive. The entrance exam was a battle between instructor and applicant, and if Julian defeated the second son of the Torso family, the Elder Association could use it to bring him down and end his infamy. Smiling, Julian addressed the crowd, noting that everyone wanted to join the Shut Eyes. When they agreed, he chuckled, calling them cowardly pieces of trash with naive, sheltered eyes. He mocked the ornamental swords they carried, then added that the Shut Eyes was the bloodiest place in the Empire. As their senior, he promised to give them a taste and declared the exam would begin. Drawing his sword with a menacing tone, he announced that the acceptance criteria was to kill him, leaving everyone shocked. Julian realized Head just stepped into it. Had only learned the entrance exam was a duel after Haran warned him not to go easy. During his fight with Eileen, running had been his only option, but in an official duel, the students would see he didn't know how to fight properly and might think he was weak. Worried about acting suspicious and provoking someone, Julian decided the best strategy was to bait them. Speaking up, he asked the students what was wrong, his tone menacing, and added that the exam would only end if he died or no applicants remained. The students hesitated, and soon one raised their hand to forfeit. As soon as one student forfeited, the rest quickly followed. Even the son of the Torso family surrendered. In an instant, all the students had bowed out. Haran and Eileen looked on in surprise, while Julian, laughing menacingly, turned and declared the exam over. Lee, smiling to himself, thought Head pulled it off and noted it was exactly the kind of ruthless, cunning Julian possessed that helped in situations like this. He then glanced at Eileen, wondering if her fear had overridden her hatred, but was confused to sense nothing at all. Lee questioned whether his color of negation was failing and worried that if a trait could just stop working, it would be a serious problem. Eileen thought to herself that Julian's actions reminded her of the Julian Sunbay from the past, who avoided unnecessary fights by intimidating opponents. At that moment, the system popped up for Julian, reminding him that the color of negation only revealed negative emotions. Later, at the Shut Eyes base, Haran ran up to Julian, calling out to him. Julian stopped, and Haran praised him for a job well done. Julian placed his hands on Haran's shoulders, scaring him. Panicked, Haran asked what was wrong, and Julian, noticing the color of negation from Haran, reassured him that it was nothing and that Haran had done all the hard work. Julian thought to himself that the color of negation was working. Just then, a man approached energetically, greeting Julian and praising his performance in the training ground. Julian asked who he was, and the man introduced himself as Lazarus, in charge of administrative tasks for the Shut Eyes, and said it was an honor to meet Julian. Lazarus continued, noting that seeing Julian proved the rumors of lost memories were false, and added that Julian had completed the exam without fighting a single applicant. Julian, thinking Lazarus wouldn't stop yapping, smirked, and sure enough, Lazarus went on, saying even the second son of the Torso family couldn't stop Julian from not going easy, as expected. Haran, shocked, confronted Lazarus, demanding how he could imply that the Torso heir had failed. Lazarus quickly apologized, insisting that wasn't his intention. Furious, Haran snapped that Lazarus had no right to act so arrogant towards someone still in training, especially given the Torso family's long-standing ties to the Cryfarts. Julian then spoke, telling Haran that he might be misunderstanding, or maybe it was the Torso family misunderstanding. Haran, confused, asked what he meant. Smiling menacingly, Julian explained that the Shut Eyes didn't accept nobles. Haran and Lazarus looked puzzled. Julian continued, saying that since the organization was directly tied to the imperial family, only commoners or fallen nobles could join. Haran pointed out that Julian himself was a noble, but Julian clarified that as a halfling of the Cryfart family, he was collateral, essentially a dog of the imperial family, not the Cryfarts. Haran was shocked. Julian added that the second son of the Torso family took the exam despite knowing he wouldn't pass the second screening, wondering whether the Torso family intended it as a lesson or if there was some deeper scheme at play. Haran panicked, realizing Julian had already seen through the plan. The exam was a trap by the Elders Association, and Haran was part of it. But Julian, smiling menacingly, dismissed it as a possible misunderstanding, warning that it would be unfortunate if his suspicion were true. Later, back at his home, the maids welcomed Julian, calling him master. One asked if he wanted dinner first, but Julian refused and ordered that no one enter his office. The maids agreed. Julian entered, set down his sword, and sank into his chair to relax. Lee, dropping his Julian act, thought about Haran's earlier reaction and realized the Elders Association likely had schemed something for the exam. He felt lucky to have avoided trouble today, but wondered how long his luck would hold. Lee thought that eventually the Elders Association could spot Julian's, or rather his, flaws, which might get him kicked from the family. Staring at Julian's sword, he worried that his inability to use the Moonlight Sword properly was a problem. Wielding it meant having overwhelming power, and maybe it was worth trying to unlock its potential. Gripping the sword, Lee muttered that, unsurprisingly, he couldn't activate it. Julian's trait as an exceptional swordsman made swordsmanship effortless. The moment he touched a blade, its path became clear. The system popped up, noting that Julian had been accustomed to swords since birth and could wield any sword type. Still, Lee knew this alone wouldn't be enough. Countless people in the Empire matched Lee, aka Julian, in swordsmanship. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of named characters existed, but Julian stood out. His aura and mana control were on another level, letting him survive with a pathological edge. Lee wondered if he could replicate that himself. Mana flowed dangerously. If mismanaged, it could destroy vital organs. Hesitant at first, Lee shook off his fear, knowing he'd have to prove himself sooner or later. Thinking seriously, he realized that if mana worked the same as in the game, he already knew the method from playing it hundreds of times. Lee resolved to channel the mana stored in his heart into his bodily mana organ, the mana meridian. Of the 38 mana meridians, 6 were the Great Veins, with the one in the head being the essence connecting to the heart. Activating it made the aura sway. As Lee tried, he felt it shift and gave a menacing smile. Success. Next, he needed to relocate the mana elsewhere. Struggling against stronger than expected resistance, Lee reminded himself that Julian's body could do it, so he pressed on. After a fight, he managed partial success, activating a fragment of the power. Looking at his sword, Lee noticed it had materialized, faint but real, like a crescent moon, and thought at least the moon had risen on the first day. Moments later, Lee was in the training ground, testing his skills on a dummy. He let out a satisfied sigh, thinking he'd at least reached the level of a knight. Now, he just needed to complete the Moonlight Sword, but his knowledge of the game was slowly running out. He realized he needed someone who truly knew Julian, someone Julian would actually ask for advice. Just then, a maid called out that he had a guest. Lee wondered if Julian even had friends, and if so, the timing was perfect. As he went to check, Lazarus appeared and greeted Julian. Lee noticed Lazarus's over-the-top enthusiasm and thought to himself that someone who spoke this much in front of Julian was either fearless or stupid. Switching back to Julian, Lee asked Lazarus what had brought him here. Lazarus explained that had received an order from the commander to confirm the results of the entrance exam Julian had conducted at Veal Academy yesterday. Julian asked if Lazarus hadn't already seen the results himself. Lazarus replied that delivering the results was part of procedure, which made Julian think the shut-eyes were ridiculously inefficient. Julian then told Lazarus to report that there were 0 passes. Lazarus acknowledged and prepared to leave, but Julian stopped him, asking if Lazarus really intended to report it. Lazarus confirmed he would. Julian then gave a menacing smile and declared he would deliver the message to the commander himself. Lazarus froze, shocked that Julian intended to go alone. Julian then remarked that he truly intended to head out alone, so he told Lazarus to accompany him to his carriage, saying that he would take Lazarus along for the ride. And upon hearing that, Lazarus' nerves completely spiraled out of control. Trembling, Lazarus asked Julian if he had done something wrong and stammered that Julian must still be upset about what happened yesterday. Yet Julian quickly dismissed the assumption. At that moment, Julian reflected silently that his only intention was to be thoughtful, believing Lazarus might feel uneasy returning alone. And in that instant, he regretted not leading a more compassionate life as Julian. Shifting the subject, Julian then mused aloud that given how things had unfolded, perhaps he should actually seek Lazarus' counsel, further noting that the commander of the Shut-Eyes was surely well acquainted with him, and finally adding that he would ensure the Krypart family would lose any chance to manipulate matters involving Shut-Eyes once he put in a word. Moments later, within the headquarters of Shut-Eyes, one of the commander's aides suddenly burst into the office, visibly alarmed, and urgently informed the commander that an issue had arisen, to which the commander, frowning, demanded to know what was causing such commotion and warned that it had better be something significant. The aide then hastily reported that he had personally arrived, prompting the commander to question who exactly he was referring to, and the aide quickly clarified that Julian Krypart Plassen himself had come seeking an audience. Upon hearing that name, the commander momentarily halted his work, his expression hardening as he repeated in a chilling tone, asking if Julian had truly appeared here. Meanwhile, Lee had by then arrived at the Adrathan Imperial Palace, and as he stood before it, he was struck with awe at the breathtaking sight, realizing he had never imagined he would one day witness such a place with his own eyes. The continent of Rosinda served as the primary setting of the game and was ruled by 3 dominant nations, with the mightiest among them being the Adrathan Empire, where Julian currently resided. Following the sealing of the demon god Barbados, the ravaged lands slowly united under an unyielding monarchy that grew into a colossal power, and the grand palace before him stood as the emblem of that authority. As Lee recalled this, he found himself deeply moved, overwhelmed by admiration, while the character Julian, in contrast, remained perfectly composed, wearing a cold and indifferent expression despite Lee's own rising excitement. As Lee quietly let out a small laugh to himself, Lazarus, visibly trembling, wondered in panic why Julian was laughing and admitted inwardly that the situation was terrifying. He then thought that under normal circumstances, one would never be able to approach Julian except through his attendants. Yet today Julian had chosen to personally meet the captain of the Shut-Eyes, and even drag someone like him along, leaving Lazarus completely bewildered about what Julian could possibly have in mind. While Lazarus wrestled with his thoughts, the surrounding onlookers whispered among themselves in confusion, questioning what was happening since it was entirely out of character for Julian to appear here alone. Some murmured that they had assumed Julian was seriously injured, but seeing him unharmed made them wonder if the rumors of his amnesia had been fabricated. As Julian maintained his intimidating expression, Lazarus felt torn between pride and dread, thinking that it was an immense privilege to stand beside him, but also feeling on the verge of fainting from fear. Just as those thoughts raced through his mind, Julian suddenly spoke, remarking that the palace remained as magnificent as ever, to which Lazarus quickly nodded in agreement, echoing Julian's words without hesitation. Julian then remarked that since this was the initial gate open to the general staff, the captain was most likely stationed beyond the restricted second barrier, and Lazarus, still overwhelmed with anxiety, hastily agreed that Julian's observation was correct. At that instant, Lazarus wondered why Julian was pointing out such obvious details, thinking that anyone affiliated with the Shut Eyes would already know this, which led him to suspect that Julian might actually be testing him. The thought struck him that Julian's aloof expression seemed to imply that a useless recruit like Lazarus needed to be evaluated once more. Overcome with panic, Lazarus feared that if he failed to guide Julian properly, he might end up being dismissed entirely. Meanwhile, Lee pondered whether his perception was broader now compared to the in-game perspective, as he couldn't even locate where the Shut Eyes headquarters stood from his current view. As he mulled that over, he noticed Lazarus behaving oddly and immediately asked if something was wrong or if Lazarus wasn't feeling well. Flustered, Lazarus quickly insisted that he was in perfect condition and emphasized that maintaining health was a top priority among the Shut Eyes, leaving Julian momentarily baffled by what Lazarus was even trying to say. A short while later, the two finally arrived at their destination, and Julian calmly mentioned that they had reached the place, while Lazarus, still visibly tense, nervously asked if he had managed to pass. Julian, puzzled, inquired what Lazarus was talking about, prompting Lazarus to hesitantly ask if this whole thing had been another one of Julian's tests. Julian, clearly confused, replied that there was no test whatsoever and questioned why he would even bother testing Lazarus in the first place. Hearing the sincerity in Julian's voice, Lazarus was taken aback and quickly assumed that this must mean he was now recognized as a fully competent member of the Shut Eyes, which filled him with overwhelming joy. As Lazarus' excitement grew, Julian silently wondered what on earth was wrong with him and why he was acting so strangely. Bursting with gratitude, Lazarus thanked Julian with a bright smile before excusing himself, leaving Julian to walk ahead alone. Meanwhile, Lee couldn't help but think that Lazarus was quite an odd fellow. Just then, one of the commander's aides approached and addressed Julian, informing him that Commander Ordwin had granted permission for his entry and that he was welcome to proceed inside. Hearing that, Lee thought to himself that the time had finally come for him to meet Julian's superior. Commander Ordwin Ballader, the last surviving descendant of the once prestigious Ballader lineage, possessed both the might and authority necessary to claim the vital role of commander. The Shut Eyes, an organization that answered only to the imperial bloodline, could be governed by none other than her. And as Lee recalled this fact, he found himself curious about what sort of presence and aura she held in person. A faint sense of unease began to rise in him as he admitted that he was starting to feel nervous. Standing before the door to the commander's chamber, Lee transitioned back into Julian's persona and announced aloud that he was about to enter. Upon hearing his voice, the commander responded, granting permission for him to come in. The moment Lee stepped inside, his eyes fell upon a small, youthful-looking woman seated behind the desk, none other than Commander Ordwin herself. Upon noticing Julian, Ordwin greeted him warmly, remarking that it had been quite some time since their last meeting, and she immediately mentioned having heard news of his injury before asking whether he was recovering well. Lee, still adjusting to the sight before him, was caught off guard by how entirely different she appeared compared to his expectations. Above all else, she was astonishingly petite. Lee recalled reading that Ordwin was supposed to be small in stature, but seeing her in person, he hadn't expected her to be this tiny, and what startled him even more was realizing that Ordwin was not only a woman, but practically looked like a young girl. As Lee's thoughts wandered over that fact, Ordwin abruptly rose from her seat and pointed at Julian, asking sharply if he was about to comment that she was still as short as ever. Julian, looking slightly flustered, quickly denied it, insisting he had no such intention, all while thinking to himself that it was indeed typical of the commander to somehow guess exactly what was on his mind. Without dwelling on it further, Ordwin shifted the conversation and demanded that he give her an update regarding his injury. Hearing that, Lee hesitated, wondering how best to phrase his response, knowing that Ordwin was not someone he could afford to underestimate. The thought made him nervous, and he worried that if he worded things carelessly, she might begin to doubt whether he truly was Julian. Lee reminded himself that even someone like Julian would have treated her with caution and respect, since the Shut Eyes were known as the loyal hounds of the imperial family, bound to obey every command without question. Lee then slipped fully back into Julian's role and spoke with calm composure, expressing his gratitude for Ordwin's concern before adding that though his injury had not been insignificant, it was far from enough to weaken his devotion to the imperial household. Upon hearing that, Ordwin simply sat in silence, her expression unreadable, which made Julian quietly wonder if he had said something out of place. Then, without warning, Ordwin rose from her chair and began to approach him, remarking that something about this seemed off before asking if Julian had always spoken in such a manner. Drawing even closer, she stated that there was something strangely unfamiliar about him, that he felt like someone entirely different, and Julian's concern spiked the moment he heard those words. Reacting instinctively, he activated his color of negation and immediately saw that Ordwin's aura burned with the shade of suspicion. Lee's mind raced as he worried over how the real Julian must have interacted with his commanding officer to make her sense a difference so quickly. Realizing he needed to regain control of the situation, Lee resolved to take the initiative and adopt the boldness of a true villain. Acting on that thought, he suddenly grasped the hilt of Ordwin's sword and, with a sharp gaze, demanded to know if she found any issue with the way he was conducting himself. Ordwin's temper flared the instant Julian's hand touched her blade, and without hesitation, she yanked it back with force. Fixing him with a cold glare, she reminded Julian that he almost never visited the Shut Eyes headquarters personally, and on the rare occasions he did, he would deliver his report and depart without indulging in unnecessary conversation. Finishing her statement, she remarked bitterly that he seemed unusually eager and attentive this time. Hearing that, Lee realized inwardly that even the real Julian must have maintained a strict boundary between duty and personal interaction within the Shut Eyes, but it appeared he had misjudged just how distant and calculating the real man truly was. Returning to his composed facade as Julian, he explained that his recent absence had been due to recovery from his injury, and that was precisely why he had decided to come in person and provide a direct update. Ordwin narrowed her eyes and questioned if that was indeed the truth. Julian, unbothered, countered by asking whether there was any issue with what he had just said, while he internally reminded himself to press forward with the same unapologetic confidence the real Julian would display. Acting on that thought, he brought his palm down firmly on the table and challenged Ordwin, demanding whether she intended to dictate even the moments he was permitted to appear. Ordwin, unfazed by his defiance, stared him down and declared that from the moment he had returned, his behavior had already crossed into outright insubordination. Ordwin then remarked that she had been informed of Julian's odd behavior following his injury, yet from what she could see, he seemed to have made a complete recovery. Hearing her blunt tone, Lee silently admitted that she was right, but still found himself irritated by how sharply she spoke to Julian, realizing that Ordwin was far from an ordinary woman. Maintaining her composure, Ordwin instructed Julian to begin his report, asking if there had been any noteworthy recruits in the recent entrance evaluation. Julian replied without hesitation, stating that there were none worth mentioning. Ordwin responded that such an outcome was hardly surprising, noting that Julian, as a disciple of the sword saint Haydenreich, naturally held far higher standards than most, and that average talent would never catch his eye. However, she clarified that what she truly wanted to know was whether there had been any candidates capable of qualifying as instructors. Julian gave the same answer as before, saying there were absolutely none. Ordwin, visibly taken aback, questioned him with disbelief, asking if he meant to say that he had failed every single applicant. When Julian confirmed it without wavering, Ordwin's expression hardened as she demanded to know why he had done such a thing. She repeated the question again and again, her tone growing sharper each time, and finally snapped, asking if Julian had completely lost his mind. Ordwin, raising her voice in frustration, shouted that the Shut Eyes were critically understaffed at the moment, and even a single capable recruit could have made a difference. Julian, maintaining his usual impassive expression, calmly replied that being short on personnel was no reason to accept useless, incompetent applicants, and he insisted that not a single candidate was qualified to join the Shut Eyes. Ordwin countered, arguing that there might still be hidden potential among some recruits that could be developed through proper training. But Julian dismissed the idea, saying it would be a waste of effort since none of them had the talent required to become trainees. As Lee voiced those words to Ordwin, he internally noted that he was mostly just trying to avoid unnecessary conflict with them. Realizing the futility of continuing the discussion, Ordwin finally sighed in exasperation and told Julian that it was impossible to reason with him, ordering him to leave her presence immediately. Julian, however, spoke up once more, stating that he had a proposal to put forward before leaving. Hearing this, Ordwin snapped, asking sharply what kind of nonsense he was trying to pull this time. Lee felt a wave of nervousness wash over him, but he reminded himself that he had to fully embody Julian at this moment. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a letter, turned back to Julian, and spoke, explaining that Julian had pinpointed the weaknesses in the current entrance exam and had compiled them all in this document. Ordwin, hearing this, raised her eyebrows in surprise, and Julian continued, noting that his observation was simply that the applicants didn't seem to grasp the true nature of the shut eyes. Ordwin, intrigued, asked if that was indeed the case. She then admitted that his point made sense, as the applicants really should have understood the kind of organization they were attempting to join. With that, Ordwin took the letter and began reading aloud. It contained a note stating that the shut eyes would not be responsible for any consequences during the entrance exam. Upon finishing, she let out a short, amused laugh and told Julian that his letter sounded as if he intended to fight the applicants with the goal of killing them, pausing to ask if she had interpreted his meaning correctly. Julian, hearing her words, remained silent and simply let out a low chuckle. Observing his reaction, Ordwin thought to herself that his lack of response likely confirmed her suspicions. She then remarked that this was unusual, considering that aside from herself, Julian held a relatively high rank within the Shut Eyes and typically did not intervene directly in internal matters such as these. After pausing to think carefully, she asked Julian if this was the reason he had failed every applicant in the entrance exam, that he wanted to avoid complications from harming those who were unprepared. Julian confirmed with a calm tone that her assumption was correct, adding that there was more to it. Applicants who passed such a rigorous exam could serve the Shut Eyes well, as the organization was closely tied to the imperial family. He went on to explain that he could not forgive anyone who sullied its honor. But just as he was about to finish, Ordwin interrupted, saying she understood his point and didn't need to hear any further. She added that Julian tended to be especially uncompromising whenever the imperial family was involved and mentioned that she would bring this matter before the council, though she could not promise it would be approved. Julian acknowledged her words and expressed gratitude for her effort, then prepared to leave, politely telling Ordwin to excuse him. Just as he reached the door, however, Ordwin called out sharply, asking him to wait. Ordwin then mentioned that she had received word from the imperial family indicating they would be visiting Julian's office, and she instructed Julian to return and confirm their arrival. Julian, hearing this, nodded and assured her that he would take care of it before leaving the room. As soon as he stepped out, Ordwin's gaze fell back on Julian's letter, and she reflected again on his comment about not being responsible for what might happen, realizing that it suggested that even if an applicant were harmed or killed during the exam, the imperial family's protection would shield the act from being treated as a crime. Naturally, this did not alter the fundamental structure of the exam itself, since only fallen nobles or commoners were permitted to apply to the Shut Eyes in the first place. Complaints from powerless applicants had previously been easy to dismiss, which explained why no issues had arisen before. Ordwin then considered that Julian was surely aware of all this, leading her to conclude that his proposal likely stemmed from noticing a scheme orchestrated by the Elders Association and the Torso family during the exam, and that this plan represented his strategic response to their plotting. Ordwin then reflected that Julian's letter was essentially a warning, signaling that he was fully aware of the schemes being plotted and that if anything like this occurred again, he would not overlook it as he had before. Considering this, she noted how audacious Julian's approach was and wondered if this might be his way of retaliating against the Elders Association. Just as she was mulling over these thoughts, a knock came at the door, and Ordwin asked who it was. One of her subordinates replied, questioning if she had summoned them, and Ordwin instructed the subordinate to take the letter she was holding to the council. As the subordinate departed with the letter, Ordwin mused internally that Julian had changed drastically since the incident. She recalled that he had once been regarded as the imperial family's loyal dog for his unwavering obedience. But now it seemed the creature that had once followed orders without question had developed its own will and was beginning to assert itself. Sensing that this shift could lead to complications, Ordwin resolved that she would need to carefully monitor Julian and remain alert to whatever actions he might take next. Meanwhile, as Lee walked down the corridor, he couldn't help but think that he had actually reached the real Julian's office within the Shut Eyes headquarters. Typically, the Shut Eyes didn't provide private offices, as there was little need for anyone to remain on standby, yet Lee wondered how extravagant Julian's space might be if such a privilege were granted. Pushing the door open, he was immediately baffled by the bizarre decorations scattered around the room, along with lavish items that had nothing to do with work. Seeing this, Lee muttered that it was even more chaotic than Julian's own home and questioned whether the real Julian might be completely unhinged. Everything looked ridiculously expensive, yet utterly tasteless, and Lee admitted to himself that he could never bring himself to respect this fox-eyed villain, concluding that the real Julian truly had the worst sense of style imaginable. At that moment, he accidentally stepped on something on the floor and grumbled that if Julian wasn't going to maintain these possessions properly, he shouldn't have brought them here at all. Just then, a knock echoed at the door, and as Lee called for the person to enter, Lazarus stepped inside with a bright, cheerful smile. He greeted Julian warmly and announced that he had come to deliver a letter from the imperial family, handing it over without delay. Julian, seeing Lazarus, remarked lightly that it felt as if he had been seeing him every day. Lee took the letter and immediately realized inwardly that this must be the same letter the captain had mentioned earlier. After handing over the letter, Lazarus began to excuse himself, but Lee, still speaking as Julian, told him to wait. Seizing the opportunity, Julian said that the timing was perfect and instructed Lazarus to load all the sculptures from the carriage he had used to arrive. Lazarus froze in surprise, asking for clarification if Julian truly meant every single item, to which Julian calmly confirmed. Overflowing with excitement, Lazarus thought in disbelief that he had once again been entrusted with a task by Julian and added to himself that perhaps his days as a mere trainee were now numbered. Lazarus immediately responded, telling Julian that he understood and would start moving the items right away, while Lee noticed inwardly that Lazarus was making that same strange expression he had before. As Lazarus lifted one of the pieces, he suddenly tripped over another item lying on the floor and tumbled hard, landing with a loud thud. Watching this, Lee couldn't help but think that Lazarus was truly a handful. Turning back to Julian, Lee, still in character, remarked that it didn't matter since the items were going to be thrown anyway. But Lazarus didn't wait for the sentence to finish. With tears welling in his eyes, he quickly apologized to Julian for the mishap and raised his sword, seemingly intent on harming himself. Just then, Julian placed a firm hand on Lazarus' shoulder and reassured him that there was absolutely no need for such an action. Lee thought to himself that Lazarus was far too frightened and decided he would try to ease the tension with a bit of humor. Julian then leaned close and whispered into Lazarus' ear that it would be far more troublesome to clean up if he died here. And upon hearing this, Lazarus, shaken by Julian's words, immediately abandoned the idea of harming himself. Lee then realized that he had frightened Lazarus simply by occupying Julian's body, which he figured was only natural, so he decided to change the subject and mentioned that he would read the letter while waiting. Picking up the letter, Lee noted that it bore the seal of the imperial family, just like in the game. As he scanned its contents, he saw that it was addressed to Sir Julian of the Cryfart family, an officer of the Shut Eyes, basically instructing him that if he had fully recovered, he should return to duty. Lee thought wryly that the imperial family seemed determined to keep him constantly working, though the letter attempted to make it sound more polite, not that he was complaining. He then reflected that gaining field experience was essential at this point, since he had yet to uncover any leads on a Moonlight Sword. The mission outlined in the letter involved restoring a resonance stone. In the Kill the Demon King Starting Now game, there are creatures known as demons. After the death of the demon god Barbados, his remains either parasitized living beings or took physical form, becoming the demons that now threaten humanity. The tools used to suppress them were called resonance stones, a remarkable legacy left by mages, and Lee wondered at that moment how anyone could create such stones using mana. Lee reflected that, since he wasn't a mage himself, his role in this mission likely involved protecting the mage responsible for restoring the resonance stone. He decided there was no reason to refuse the task, reasoning that although confronting demons carried inherent risks, completing the mission successfully would probably quell the recent suspicious rumors surrounding Julian. As he considered this, Lee wondered who the mage he would be assigned to protect might be. He also noted that handling a resonance stone required considerable skill, and hoped that the mage in question was competent and reliable. Meanwhile, in the Adrathan Imperial Palace, a woman could be heard grumbling about why she still had to keep writing reports even after attaining the rank of professor, and this woman was none other than Eileen herself. She muttered that perhaps this was the lot of a mage, always needing to prove their worth. But she also complained that the imperial family's demands were far too excessive. Just then, as Eileen was lost in thought, a voice called out to her, asking what had brought her to this spot. Eileen, curious about who it could be, responded by asking who was speaking, and as she turned to look, she realized it was none other than her longtime friend, Diana. Eileen immediately exclaimed that it had been ages since they last met and asked Diana how she had been doing. Diana, smiling warmly, remarked that Eileen must be incredibly busy as the youngest professor and added that it had become so rare to see her lately. Eileen, returning the smile, told Diana that she didn't need to flatter her so much. Diana then asked if Eileen had any free time at the moment and invited her to join a tea party she was attending. Eileen, looking conflicted, apologized and explained that she would love to come but needed to focus on her thesis. Diana, understandingly, told Eileen that she got it and added that Eileen was just as hardworking and diligent as ever. Diana continued, saying that it reminded her of their student days and how little had changed since then. But as she spoke, she noticed Eileen acting unusually and immediately asked what was wrong. Just as she said that, her gaze shifted and she spotted something behind them. Pointing toward a carriage, she asked Eileen if that wasn't Senior Julian's carriage over there. Eileen's eyes widened in surprise, and she quickly turned to look, confirming that it truly was Julian's carriage. She thought to herself that the crest on it belonged exclusively to the collateral branches of the Cryfart family, leaving no doubt that the carriage was indeed Julian's. Diana then remarked that she had heard Julian had been gravely ill and wondered aloud if he had already returned, adding that he was remarkably persistent. Eileen nodded in agreement, acknowledging Diana's observation. However, as their conversation continued, Diana suddenly shifted topics and asked Eileen about the current situation, leaving Eileen momentarily puzzled about what exactly she meant. Diana, letting out a teasing, almost wicked laugh, asked Eileen if she still harbored feelings for Julian. Eileen's cheeks flushed instantly, and she stammered that she had no idea what Diana was talking about. Diana continued, reminiscing about the past, remarking that Eileen had been such an innocent, sweet girl back then. She teased that when Eileen had heard the rumor that anyone who confessed beneath the cherry tree on the hill behind the academy would never be rejected, she had dragged Julian all the way there. Eileen, recalling the memory, felt her face heat up once again. Wanting to move on, she suggested to Diana that perhaps they should head to the tea party together. Diana expressed surprise, having thought Eileen was too busy, but Eileen quickly denied it, claiming she had just realized she had some free time. Diana reassured her, saying there was no need to be embarrassed, noting that nearly every girl had liked Julian at the time, though Eileen had been the most devoted. Still blushing and flustered, Eileen thanked Diana for her words, though inwardly she wished the conversation would end before her embarrassment grew any worse. At that moment, as Eileen reflected on the situation, she acknowledged that Diana was right, realizing that Julian was no longer the same person he used to be, as he had drastically changed after returning from the Northern Front and becoming involved with the Shut Eyes. While she was lost in those thoughts of the past, Diana spoke up again and urged her to at least greet Julian. This only irritated Eileen, prompting her to firmly assert that just because she had once liked Julian did not mean those feelings still remained. With a confident demeanor, she further stated that she would not have to see him for quite some time. This caused Diana to question the reason behind such a statement, at which point Eileen revealed a letter in her hand and explained that she would be leaving the palace for a while. Diana noticed the letter and realized it was from the imperial family, which Eileen confirmed before explaining that she had been assigned a mission. When Diana wondered about its nature, Eileen disclosed that it involved the restoration of a resonance stone. Moments later, in an unknown location, a group of guard knights could be seen heading toward a destination. Among them, one knight questioned the unusually large gathering, wondering if an A-ranking individual was present. Another explained that he had heard even the Shut Eyes and the Order of the Blue Lion would be participating, adding that it was supposedly a special mission and that Julian of the Shut Eyes would also be joining. This surprised the first knight, as he had come across rumors claiming that Julian had lost his memories. However, those claims were immediately dismissed as nothing more than false rumors spread by those envious of him. The knight agreed that such speculation was to be expected and remarked that he could not imagine someone like Julian ever being endured. At that moment, Julian himself arrived, quietly thinking that he was glad to have accepted the mission and noting that the negative rumors surrounding him seemed to be fading. As he observed his surroundings, he was approached by two knights who called out to him and introduced themselves as Perrin from the Order of the Blue Lion and Hainlike. Upon hearing their introductions, Julian expressed his gratitude for their efforts and stated that they would work together to protect the mages until they reached Julin, though he also warned that anything could happen along this since the appearance of demons was unpredictable and such encounters would be disastrous. As he said this, he wore a menacing expression that left the two knights visibly shaken and uneasy. This prompted them to quickly change the subject and suggest that Julian should board the carriage for the journey. Heinlein further added that the responsibility of guarding the mages could be left to them, while Julian rested until they reached their destination. This led Julian to internally note that while their words sounded considerate, it did not seem to be for his comfort. The Order of the Blue Lion served as the Empire's official knights, and, unlike the Shut Eyes, were mostly composed of nobles, making it apparent that they were trying to ensure that someone from a collateral bloodline would not outshine them. As his thoughts shifted back to Lee, he reflected on how people summoned to another world were usually granted a better life, remarking bitterly that his own case was unfortunate as he had been summoned as a villain and such circumstances were inevitable. He then reasoned that traveling in the carriage might still be more comfortable. With that, he returned to acting as Julian and informed the two knights of his decision, leaving them visibly relieved that the conversation had concluded without issue. At that moment, Perrin spoke up and stated that now that everything was settled, they would inform Julian about the mage named Eileen. Just as he was about to finish, Julian suddenly reacted with surprise and asked them to repeat the mage's name. At that very moment, Eileen herself arrived at the scene, greeting everyone while casually remarking on the pleasant weather before introducing herself as the one who would be leading the restoration of the resonant stone. However, as soon as she and Julian made eye contact, she abruptly stopped speaking, clearly taken aback by his presence. Meanwhile, Julian, now visibly troubled, informed Perrin and Heinlein that he would be disregarding the earlier plan about the carriage. This left the two knights surprised by a sudden change in stance. At the same time, Eileen, now inside the carriage, found herself blushing uncontrollably as she questioned why Julian was there and, more importantly, whether he had intentionally tried to avoid her. Meanwhile, Lee, within Julian, reflected that Eileen was an unpredictable person and admitted that being around her made him uncomfortable since he could not read what she was thinking. At that moment, as Julian made his decision, Perrin and Heinlein were caught off guard by a sudden change in attitude. The two began to question the reason behind it, wondering if he was attempting to assert dominance over them. Heinlein, growing increasingly irritated, internally questioned whether Julian had realized his intention of taking command by pushing him to the rear. He concluded that it was only natural for someone who had survived the ruthless struggles of the imperial family without any backing to be so perceptive. Yet at the same time, he criticized Julian for being arrogant despite coming from a collateral line. He even suspected that Julian might be looking down on them due to his recognition by the imperial family. On the other hand, Julian sensed a hostile gaze directed at him, but chose not to react. Instead, he focused on the realization that no one had informed him that Eileen was the very mage he was assigned to protect. Upon observing her, he noticed that she appeared uneasy. This led him to decide that since the situation had come to this, he would complete the mission as quickly as possible while avoiding any unnecessary interaction with her. Moments later, Julian came to a halt and announced that they had arrived at Julin. As he took in his surroundings, he reflected that this modest place was where the resonant stone was located, finding it surprisingly small and noting that despite being dispatched directly by the Empire, there was no one present to welcome them. Just as he considered this, a local resident approached and asked if he was from the Empire. Julian confirmed, prompting the man to warmly welcome him and acknowledge the long journey before offering to guide them to the location of the resonant stone. Shortly after, Eileen assumed command of the situation, directing the men to bring the chest containing the resonant stone while instructing that the mana boxes be taken elsewhere. She added that she would personally handle the chest due to its sensitivity to mana. After this, the man called out to her and requested that she inspect the damaged stone. As she agreed and carefully examined it, Eileen concluded that it could not be fully repaired and would require partial replacement. This left the man confused as he questioned what she meant by replacing it. However, in that moment, Eileen composed herself and added just her expression. She explained that the barrier would temporarily disappear during the process, but reassured the man that it would not take long. This led him to express his trust in her. As she placed her hand on the stone, she confirmed that all preparations were complete before realizing that she needed to inform Julian about the temporary loss of the barrier. Although she had no desire to face him, she reminded herself that this was work and that she needed to remain professional in her role as a professor. Despite her hesitation, She called out to him, only for Julian to deliberately ignore her and continue walking. This prompted her to persist and state that she had something important to tell him. Yet he still refused to stop. This made her question whether he had been avoiding her all along and wonder about the reason behind it. She even considered the possibility that he might have discovered that she had been observing him. However, she ultimately dismissed any justification for his behavior, concluding that regardless of personal matters, he was still on a mission and that she needed to confront him directly. At that moment, Eileen grabbed Julian by his clothes and demanded to know why he had been avoiding her. Julian denied it outright, claiming that he had not avoided her at all and instead insisted that she was the one persistently following him. This left Eileen taken aback by his response as she began to question what had gotten into him, even finding herself momentarily swayed by the confidence with which he spoke. Though blushing, she brushed off his words as irrelevant to the situation at hand. This prompted Julian to respond with a menacing smile as he questioned what could possibly be more important while mockingly referring to her as a stalker. This immediately infuriated Eileen and led her to angrily challenge how he could dare to call her such a thing. However, in the midst of their heated exchange, a sudden loud explosion rang out. This was followed by the terrified screams of people announcing that demons had appeared. Julian reacted with surprise, while Eileen quickly clarified that this was exactly what she had been trying to warn him about, explaining that with the barrier temporarily down, demons could emerge at any moment. At that moment, Eileen attempted to shift the conversation and once again questioned why Julian had been avoiding her. Before he could respond, a person suddenly came flying past them. Julian, shocked by what had just happened, immediately turned toward the source, only to see that the one who had been struck down was none other than Heinleich, lying lifeless on the ground. As Julian's gaze shifted to the attacker, he realized that the demon responsible bore not one, but two horns, an unexpected and alarming sight. Eileen, noticing his reaction, asked what had happened, only for Julian to quickly warn her not to come any closer due to the danger. Upon seeing the demon herself, Eileen was overcome with fear as she recognized the threat posed by a two-horned demon, questioning why such a powerful being would appear in a place like this. As she struggled to decide what to do, she realized that she was unable to cast any combat spells at the moment and that the resonant stone was not yet ready for use. Just then, the demon released a deafening roar, prompting one of its underlings to suddenly charge straight toward Eileen. Eileen panicked as the demon charged straight toward her, but just as it was about to reach her, Julian stepped in front of her and eliminated the creature with ease. After dealing with it, he immediately warned her not to let her guard down, criticizing her for being too naive to be shaken by something like that. He then calmly stated that he would handle the situation there and that they should each focus on what they were responsible for. This left Eileen momentarily confused until Julian clarified that her role was to restore the resonant stone while his was to protect her. After saying this, he questioned whether she had been so startled that she had forgotten the purpose of their mission. This caused Eileen to feel embarrassed, though she quickly regained her composure and informed him that it would take her 7 more minutes to complete the restoration. With that, she hurried back toward the stone to continue her work. However, before fully leaving, she turned back and, with a flustered expression, called out to Julian and asked him not to get hurt, admitting that she was unable to use healing magic. Julian responded that it would be far more difficult for him to get hurt than the other way around. But the moment he said that, he reverted back to being Lee, who internally reflected that he had spoken boldly despite feeling genuine fear, as he had not expected to encounter a two-horned demon during what was supposed to be field experience. He realized that running away was not an option due to the number of people watching, knowing that doing so would only spark negative rumors and raise suspicion about him. This led him to bitterly think that if he were the real Julian, handling the situation would have been much easier. Before he could dwell on it further, Parent of the Order of the Blue Lion stepped forward and told Julian to stand back, asserting that their order would take down the demon. As he spoke, the knights charged ahead and began cutting down the lesser demons in their path. While the battle unfolded, Perrin thought to himself that the situation was favorable for them as long as they steadily wore down the two-horned demon. With that in mind, he turned toward Julian and questioned whether he was afraid of the creature, remarking that such behavior did not suit someone like him. Upon hearing that, Lee quickly came to a decision, and as his expression changed, Perrin and the other knights were left stunned, unable to believe that Julian was actually laughing in such a dire situation. Meanwhile, Lee, letting out a menacing laugh, reminded himself that at this moment he was not Lee but Julian, and reasoned that if the real Julian were facing a life-and-death battle like this, he would be enjoying it rather than fearing it. As that thought solidified, the system suddenly appeared and notified him that the trait Exceptional Swordsman had been activated. With that surge of ability, Lee launched a powerful strike at the two-horned demon, dealing significant damage in a single blow. This left Perrin astonished as he struggled to comprehend how Julian could inflict such damage with just one attack. Meanwhile, Julian, continuing to laugh as he immersed himself in the thrill of the fight, realized that his approach was working and began relentlessly attacking the demon, landing repeated blows that steadily wore it down. However, in the midst of his excitement, he unknowingly let his guard slip, allowing the demon to seize the opportunity and counterattack with a devastating strike that sent him flying backward and left him severely injured. Coughing up blood, Julian struggled to breathe as the pain overwhelmed him, realizing just how severe the damage was. Despite the situation, he grimly reflected that even a cornered creature would fight back, concluding that there was now only one option left for him. As he made up his mind, the demon launched another powerful attack in his direction. This prompted the surrounding knights to assume that Julian had finally been defeated. Meanwhile, Perrin internally acknowledged that there was no way Julian could take down a two-horned demon on his own and decided that it was time for him to take command of the battle. However, just as he prepared to act, one of the knights suddenly shouted for everyone to look in another direction. As their attention shifted, they witnessed a figure enveloped in a radiant blue aura, revealing none other than Julian himself, who had activated his imperfect moonlight sword, standing once again with an intense expression and an almost excited energy as he prepared to face the demon without the slightest hesitation. At that moment, upon seeing the sword, Lee realized it must be the rumored moonlight sword. He noted internally that it was not even half as powerful as the original, yet considered it sufficient as a handicap. With that thought, he launched into an assault on the demon, taking clear enjoyment in overwhelming it from all directions. As the battle continued, Lee observed that despite the demon's sluggish appearance, its attacks were exceptionally sharp and dangerous. Even so, he found himself able to see through every movement, a clarity that stemmed from the fact that he was none other than Julian. Deciding to make full use of this advantage, he activated his skill trait, Insight. Embracing Julian's persona, a menacing laughter overtook him as he effortlessly evaded each of the demon's attacks. The knights watched in astonishment as Julian maneuvered with flawless precision. Meanwhile, Perrin, overwhelmed with shock, became acutely aware of the vast difference in strength between himself and Julian. At the same time, Eileen had just finished repairing the resonance stone. She immediately returned to where the men were still fighting, announcing that the barrier would soon be activated again. Meanwhile, the demon, realizing it stood no chance against Julian, began searching for a way to escape. Julian quickly noticed this lapse in focus and, with a menacing amusement, took advantage of the moment. The demon fell in a panic, unable to decide its next move. Julian wasted no time and unleashed a series of swift and devastating strikes that stunned all who witnessed them. In an instant, the two-horned demon was completely disintegrated by the overwhelming force of his attacks. After the battle, Julian calmly walked away. Within his mind, control shifted back to Lee, who struggled to believe that everything had truly happened. As Lee continued walking, he noticed the fear in everyone's eyes. This reaction did not surprise him. As the character he had inherited, Julian was known to be a villain, making such fear an inevitable response to the display of his power. A battered soldier staggered forward and called out to Julian, reaching for him with trembling hands as overwhelming relief replaced the terror he had felt moments before, having truly believed they were all going to die. His gratitude set off a surge of cheers among the other soldiers, their voices rising in celebration of survival as Julian looked around, visibly caught off guard by the sudden praise. Even Fern stepped forward, offering acknowledgement with clear reluctance, though the gesture carried a subtle tension that only deepened when Julian responded with a calm and polite smile. The reaction unsettled Fern further, as Julian casually requested to leave the rest of the cleanup in their hands, noting his lack of suitability for managing the aftermath. Fern agreed, but his voice held a strange edge as he reflected on how different Julian seemed, even among nobles. His composure after such a brutal fight felt unnatural, almost inhuman, not as an insult, but as a genuine and uneasy observation. Later, Julian made his way into a quiet forest and found a secluded pond. There, he finally allowed himself to collapse onto a nearby rock and release a long, exhausted breath. The entire ordeal had been far more dangerous than he cared to admit, and the fear combined with adrenaline still lingered in his body. His hands trembled slightly as the memory of the demon's face resurfaced in his mind, the sensation of cutting through it leaving an unsettling weight deep within him. He found himself wondering how the real Julian had ever grown accustomed to experiences like that, only to realize something even more troubling. The longer he remained in this body, the more his thoughts seemed to shift, gradually aligning with instincts that were not originally his own. This change began to disturb him. Driven by curiosity, he brought up his status window and noticed a newly formed ability glowing faintly on the screen. It was born from the fusion of his own knowledge and Julian's combat memory, forming a power capable of identifying an enemy's weaknesses. He acknowledged its usefulness, especially in maintaining appearances, though it did little to address a more pressing issue. The Moonlight Sword remained incomplete.